In hindsight, do you think school closures were a mistake?
We were always very clear that school closures had to be absolutely the last resort.
Well, we all know that the Labour Party and Labour politicians are very good at rewriting history, for completely forgetting their own flip-flopping and their own lies and hypocrisy. These guys sitting over here, all of them, especially Jonathan Ashworth and Keir Starmer, who kept pushing and pushing and pushing for lockdowns, for school closures and everything else, suddenly, now that I've seen that everything's fine and people are actually sick and tired of all those things and they can smell the next election coming, they've come out and say, well, we've always been very clear that, school closures, for example, should have been a last resort. Lockdown in general, no, didn't really like it. Thanks to Guido Fawkes finding the collection of the old interviews, by old, we're talking about a few months ago, from Starmer and others over the last couple of years, it exposes the truth behind the Labour Party.
In hindsight, do you think school closures were a mistake?
We were always very clear that school closures had to be absolutely the last resort. We never wanted to see schools closed.
It is sadly, tragically inevitable that schools will have to close, and therefore they should be part of the national restrictions that should come into force, or that closure should be part of the national restrictions that come into force as quickly as possible.
When would you propose they close?
So I think that these national restrictions need to be put in place as soon as possible.
You say that you thought it should be a last resort, and you didn't want schools to close. But I mean, your then Shadow Education Secretary Rebecca Long-Bailey was saying in May and June that the government must commit to not opening schools unless they meet 5 specific tests. She said that twice. She was very adamant that schools should stay closed unless they could prove otherwise.
We always wanted schools to stay open where they could.
So primary school should close tomorrow, under your plan?
The question isn't whether just schools close. We need a national set of restrictions. We need to go back to the spirit of March of stay at home.
There was a period at the start of the pandemic in 2020 where we knew less about the virus and there was a concern about infection rates in schools, but also, by the way...
Oh yeah, what was it? Or was it just literally about 9 months ago, 6 months ago you were saying the same thing? Starmer's last part of the interview, as you just saw, he actually said, oh no, the closures and lockdowns is not just schools. Everything should close. Everything should close now. And that wasn't necessarily, we're not talking about February, March 2020. They kept repeating the same line over and over again because they thought that that's how it is to be in opposition. By agreeing with the government, by demanding something that the government is already going to be doing, and then criticizing the government even though it was your own policy when it went wrong. Just a reminder, because we are moving away from lockdown days and all this nonsense we are, and there's still a lot of issues to still discuss in terms of jabs and everything else, mandates, but in case some of us forget within the next couple of years, the next election, it's good to make these videos every now and then to remind us what we are actually dealing with. The hypocrites who call themselves the Labour Party.